we continue to see a need for a significant investment in rural areas for affordable housing. And, to the extent that given the budget situation, we are able to do that, we are. What we're trying to do in multifamily is focus more on the revitalization of our existing housing rather than trying to create new construction, new housing in rural areas, and that's because we get a lot more leverage, a lot more bang for our buck when we're doing that, and also because most of our projects are well over 20 years old and are in need of revitalization, and to the extent that we are trying to encourage the projects to come forward that are interested or that have a plan to revitalize in ways that include energy conservation in order to reduce the operating costs of the particular project. So, for example, in the funds availability notices that we send out, we award additional points for projects that are coming forward with green plans, for example, for trying to that have LEED or other Energy Star appliances that they're putting in, where they're trying to improve weatherization of the existing projects, new roofing, anything that will improve the energy conservation and the energy usage, and make the operating cost, that part of the operating cost, less onerous to the project, and therefore reduce the overall cost of the project. So that's where we are with that. We're really trying to focus on revitalizing our existing housing and provide rural tenants with a modernized, upgraded, revitalized project that they're proud to call their home. Much more so than we are focusing on the maybe the new needs for new potential tenants out there, just because it's revitalization is critical, it's necessary for us, and it's something that's long since overdue on our part. So we are focusing on that. On the single-family side, we do have. We don't necessarily have an energy conservation program that we're trying to facilitate per se. We do have the 504 grant program, which is, or loan and grant program, which is targeted towards repairs and revitalization of single-family housing. We also have a housing preservation grant program in multifamily, but that's actually also geared more towards single-family, trying to revitalize single-family housing. And the purpose of both of those programs is to try to provide funds for low and very low-income homeowners to be able to make needed repairs, particularly when it comes to health and safety issues. I think the most prevalent of those is heating and air conditioning, or heating, and weatherization types of issues that are critical to the individual homeowner. So we're trying to. We do have a grant program that is for specifically for seniors over the age of 62. Where if they do meet very low-income standards, they are eligible for a grant of up to $7,500 from us. And we also have the loan program is eligible for up to $20,000. And again, it's for needed repairs and rehabilitation to the existing single-family housing for those tenants, for those homeowners, in order to try to make sure that they can make sure that their home continues to stay livable, and that there are no health or safety problems with that particular home. So I think from our standpoint, just an overall summary of where we are in terms of affordable housing. We are trying to focus on that. We do, to the extent that we are able to, given our budget resources, and we are trying to focus very heavily on our low and very low income homeowners and tenants. We are trying to, for example, through the Single Family Direct program, focus that's very heavily focused on low and very low income home ownership. In our multifamily program. We have rental assistance, which is about a $900 million program to provide assistance to low and very low income tenants in our multifamily properties. So we are trying to make sure that we do provide a support for both single family and multifamily people out in rural America to the extent that we can.
Being examples of the Central Appalachia, the Lower Mississippi Delta, border colonial communities along the U.S.-Mexico border, Native American lands, and migrant and seasonal farm workers. And just to give a little, or to predicate my remarks before I get into age-specific remarks about seniors, just to talk about basically the demographics of rural America in general very quickly, just to give you some perspective. Most Americans live within 300 or 350 cities in the U.S. and the surrounding metropolitan areas. We're the inverse, or in rural areas, I say we, but the Housing Assistance Council represents the population, largely the inverse of that, where rural America, depending on what definition you use, between the population is somewhere between 20 and 25% of the entire U.S. population. So we comprise about 1/5 of the United States population, but are spread across more than 90% of the nation's landmass. And I just wanted to predicate up my remarks in that housing conditions are often very market specific. So these are large, general, broad overviews, but and they vary a lot by region or by area, especially when you're looking at 90% of the nation's landmass. Just to give some very brief demographics about the aging population in rural America, and you've probably already had some references to this earlier in the afternoon or earlier this morning, but rural America is older than the nation as a whole. It has a higher median age. The median age in the U.S. is somewhere around 36 point something. It's around 37. In rural and small town communities, we estimate the median age to be somewhere around 40. There's a larger senior population. Nationwide, roughly 12.6% of the U.S. population is age 65 or older. In rural and small town communities, that's upwards of 15%. And approximately 1/4 of the nation's older population, those being age 65 and older, live in rural and small town communities. I apologize, I'm a little bit naked. For those of you who've sat through some of my presentations before, I'm somewhat naked without maps or PowerPoints, so I maybe have a virtual map. But this varies a lot, and this just gets back to my point about this varies a lot across markets. In some areas of rural America, we have actually relatively young median ages. But in others, this is a substantial demographic shift where certain portions of the U.S., if you can visualize the U.S. map, largely in the Midwest Plain states, from North Dakota down to Oklahoma and those states, you have very large concentrations of persons age 65 and older. Also in areas where you've seen population loss, demographic population loss. So there, just to give some point of reference, in many rural communities, there's an age imbalance, really. You have a large proportion of seniors, which directly impacts the housing and provision of housing in these communities. These demographics in some of these communities are largely a factor, I think, personally, of economic patterns or factors where large portions of the younger and working age population, and particularly those with higher education, have left these areas, which has left in some communities an age imbalance where you have large proportions of seniors. The housing issues and some of the housing boom in some of these communities are the construction of nursing homes, actually, to be quite honest, in certain portions of the Midwestern U.S. and population loss areas. There are also, maybe we'll get into later, some direct housing impacts to this demographic shift. I'm sure that you already had, just to give you a few broad overpoints, I think, about housing and seniors in rural communities, and you probably have already discussed this, the silver tsunami, the large, burgeoning population that's getting ready to move into the ranks of the older age. But I do think it's also extremely important, and I'm not a gerontologist, I think this is just common sense, but to look at this population not as a monolithic group. The housing needs, the social, economic, and housing needs and service needs of persons aged 65 to 74 are much different than those 85 plus. So I think that's vitally important to look at the population in that respect. Just to share one anecdote, I've often been made fun of because I use this term, but seniors are the least mobile population, and I mean that in housing mobility. housing moves. There's some misnomer or some small points of demographic shift where seniors do leave. They do leave their house and are somewhat mobile after they become age 65. But for the most part, that's not true. Seniors are the most stable group in terms of residential mobility in the United States. I do think what has changed, and it's somewhat endemic in possibly some of these communities that I pointed to, is that the population below them, the younger populations in this country, have actually moved and are much more mobile than seniors, and again, in terms of residential mobility. And that impacts things like service provision wildly, because most seniors, whether rural, urban, or whatever, their key service provision or their assistance comes from family and household. While there are good services out there, that's the primary care provider for most seniors, an assistance provider. To touch on a few brief housing comments, I think I like to look at this personally as the housing conditions for seniors in any community along a housing continuum, or the housing choices, whether, and you may have already mentioned this or may discuss this, where there would be a range of options for seniors or any population, for any population in general, but specifically for seniors, giving levels of care where you have a large range or a continuum, which would be on one end of the continuum, almost independent housing, so single-family home ownership where you're largely independent, going down a range of options to rental housing, assisted housing, housing plus services, down to those options that have the most level of dependent care, which would be nursing homes. In many rural communities, there are gaps in this continuum for various reasons: spatial density reasons, economic reasons, service provision reasons. But in some rural communities, actually many of these that we mentioned before, the only housing options for seniors are living in your single-family home or the nursing home. There's no real range of options in between, and that's a key element, I think, to keep in mind. Next, just looking at home ownership, or basically what we would classify as housing tenure, just some very basic demographics about seniors in rural communities. I think we often view home ownership versus rental housing in kind of a dichotomous paradigm, where we look at tenure just in two elements of ownership versus rental. And really, I think it's three elements. There's rental housing, there's home ownership, and then there's home ownership free and clear without a mortgage. So there's home ownership with a mortgage and home ownership without a mortgage. Seniors have very high home ownership rates in the nation in general. The U.S. home ownership rate is roughly two-thirds, around 66 point, whatever it is this month, 66.7, 66.8%. Seniors, it's close nationwide. Persons age 65 and older, the home ownership level is roughly 80%. In rural and small town communities, it's even higher, closer to 85%. With that said, I think it's also vitally important to notice that many of these seniors are what we would classify as true homeowners. They own their home free and clear of debt, even higher in rural communities, and that's an important issue, especially in terms of an important element, especially in terms of the equity and value. Most people, the largest equity or source of value or home equity and wealth is their home. And this is vitally important to seniors as they grow older. I would look at I know this discussion focuses on structure type and the type of housing. Manufactured housing is not as prevalent among seniors as it is for the entire rural population. We estimate that somewhere between 6.5 or 7% of the occupied housing stock in the United States are manufactured homes. It's slightly higher for rural seniors, but for the population as a whole, about 15% of the occupied housing stock in rural areas are for seniors. I mean, it's occupied by manufactured housing. Those age 65 and older, it's about 6.6% or 6.5%. And I'll somewhat wind down there with our kind of introductory comments so we can have a discussion. I would like to point to two other final items, the first of which being the importance of the USDA programs that Bryan mentioned. We often work with groups, and these are kind of a vital source of vital source of funding and services. I'll have to be honest, I think I got my start working with some USDA rural housing programs in eastern Kentucky, and one of the few memorable things I've ever done was make Section 504 home loans and grants to older women who didn't have bathrooms in eastern Kentucky. So I think those are some of the more memorable personally for me, some of my greatest memories in affordable housing. to date. So I think these are vitally important. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bryan, but the Section 504 program has rehabilitated or repaired more than 300,000 housing units throughout its career, throughout its history. And one key underlying truth about seniors in their homes is they want to remain in their home as long as possible, especially in rural communities where they're familiar with these areas. And the programs such as these, the 504, Section 504 loan and grant programs, are extremely important, as well as the Section 515 rental housing programs, which have a large percent of the residents are age 62 and older. And finally, I would just like to note that the Housing Assistance Council itself has a rural housing senior initiative. It has two major goals: is to improve the housing conditions of rural seniors, as well as improve the capacity of organizations that assist this population. And I would like to note Janice Clark from the Housing Assistance Council directs this initiative. You can find out more information about HAC's Rural Senior Housing Initiative, and I would be remiss to say it's funded by the Atlantic Philanthropies. I always have to put that in, but it's funded by the Atlantic Philanthropies. You can access more information on our Senior Housing Initiative from HAC's website, or just to talk with Janice directly.
It's about 4,400, or roughly about 30% of all of our 15,000 or so 515s that we have. And there are about 123,000 units out of a total of about 460, I believe it is, 470,000 units. So we're roughly about 30 to 35%. One thing I did notice was the number of tenants receiving rental assistance in elderly directed projects was higher than average. It was about 82% of all of the tenants are receiving rental assistance, which is, I think on average, it's more like about 65 to 70%. So they are receiving a higher higher percentage of rental assistance than tenants in family-based units.
If I may add to that, and I'm not trying to correct, I do think those, Bryan, were just age-specific properties, correct?
Yes.
I think the overall population, if you look at, because not all 515s are age-specific, the age 62 and older population is somewhere around 64% or 65% in the entire stock.
I'm the coordinator of HAC's Rural Senior Housing Initiative, and basically it's a four-prong initiative which includes grants, loans, technical assistance and training, and advocacy. We just finished our first round of funding for our grant program, which gave $360,000 to about 21 organizations across the country. And one of them was the Northwest Cooperative Development Corporation, which is using the funds to help convert mobile home communities, I probably said that wrong, manufactured housing communities, to resident-owned. So we actually have a direct connection to a lot of the topic today. We've also put money into HAC's loan funds, our Preservation Rural Housing Loan Fund and our Rural Housing Loan Fund. And those are to preserve housing and help develop housing for seniors specifically.
We do have a pilot program in New Hampshire that would facilitate the conversion of manufactured housing parks into owner, I don't know, that's probably not the right word, but resident-owned communities. And I think we've got 3 that we've tentatively approved, waiting for certain specific requirements to be met first before we actually will allow those units in those parks to be financed through either our direct or guaranteed program. But I know that that is a pilot that's ongoing. That we're just waiting for some additional work to be done on behalf of the individual communities and amending their bylaws. But that is something that we are looking at as a potential pilot, just to see the success of that program in New Hampshire.
Mike, Ellen, Mike over here. Yeah, while we're getting the mic there, Bryan, just so you know, we are going to have Mike. You're going to talk about rock.
I hope I didn't steal your thunder.
But so
No, that's great that you brought that up, and that it really is groundbreaking for the work that we're all trying to do in resident-owned communities, because as Andrea said in her comments, and I'll talk about it some more a little bit later. The first step in this process of intervening in this market and transforming it is enabling the residents to own the land under their homes. And then the second huge step is what you're talking about, which is bringing conventional, smart, fair mortgages, as Stacy talked about earlier, to homeowners in those communities so that their opportunity for asset appreciation and wealth building is there.
But I think an equally important element to look at in this whole equation is the supply side, especially with, say, components like the Section 515, the owners of that property. Many of them are themselves becoming seniors and don't want to deal with the programs anymore. You're seeing this in small banking in the U.S. and actually in manufactured home communities where you have mom and pop owners who are simply getting out. So I think it's important to look at this as a large component of the demographic, not just on the demand side, but on the supply side. I think that's an important element. I would note as well, just on the manufactured housing issues, I would just like to point people to AARP's excellent publication on shifting the balance of power. And I don't know if you've already mentioned this or not, but it's an excellent resource for notably senior communities. I usually in my PowerPoint presentation have a slide of it, but it's a great resource to use, and it might be mentioned later today. But I just like to note that on the manufactured housing side. Thanks.